I think that when it comes to assessments of a potential conflict between Iran and the US or Iran and US allies, these assessments are often built from a US perspective of the geopolitical dynamics in the region or the perspective of US allies. However, when we look at the region through the lens of Iran, through the view of Iranian policymakers, it becomes abundantly clear that Iran has no interest in conflict and that it will do everything possible to prevent a conflict. And the simple reason is that it is winning, that the dynamics and circumstances in the region as they are today are in Iran's favor. When Iran looks at Iraq, it sees that its allies are firmly embedded in the state, its militias are being incorporated into the national army, the other militias are allowed to roam with impunity, and despite the fact that Trump's maximum pressure forced Iran to cede the premiership of the government, there's now calls for early elections, and Iran's allies are preparing to regroup in order to seize the premiership for themselves once more. In Syria, Assad is still standing despite the sanctions, and Biden's only real options would be to support the Kurds, which would provoke conflict with Turkey and prevent any real initiative to support any anti-Assad movement. In Yemen, where Biden is expected to rein in the Saudis and force negotiations, that negotiating table will have Iran, which will be represented by the Houthis, the UAE, which will be represented by the southern separatists, and Saudi Arabia, the weakest party, which will be represented by an internationally recognized government that Biden will have no interest in restoring, essentially meaning that Yemen will be divided between spheres of influence, the Iranians to the north and the UAE to the south. When Iran looks at Lebanon, it sees that the international community has failed to support the popular will that brought down the government, and now we're back to a negotiation between Saudi-backed Hariri and between Iran-backed Hezbollah in order to form a government. Iran sees no reason to enter into a conflict that might jeopardize these gains, and the prospective negotiations with Biden that might alleviate the economic sanctions that Trump has made even more fierce will allow Iran greater capabilities to really assert itself, especially if it is a deal similar to that which Obama made that recognized Iran's supremacy in Iraq, that meant Obama leaned on pro-Iran militias to fight ISIS, that meant that the US established a framework of power sharing with Iran in the region at the expense of Iran's rivals. Iran has no reason to enter into a conflict despite these assassinations, and now it's a waiting game for the light at the end of the tunnel that Biden offers for Iran.